All right, let's jump right into today's explainer and tackle something we've all struggled with. That incredibly frustrating feeling when you just completely lose your drive for a task you genuinely care about. We've all been there, right? You have a goal, you logically know it's super important, you want the outcome, and yet when it's actually time to sit down and do the work, you just stall out. Well, today we're skipping the generic productivity hacks and looking under the hood at the actual biological mechanics of why this happens.
You know the exact feeling we're talking about here. Motivation almost never fails like a simple light switch that just cleanly flips off so you can walk away. Nope, it fades, it comes back a little, it resists, and then it completely ghosts you right when you need it the absolute most. And that maddening inconsistency? That's exactly what makes it feel so deeply personal. It leaves you with this awful, sinking feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with you or your willpower. But as we're going to see, blaming your character is literally the worst way to look at it.
So let's bust a massive myth right out of the gate. Neuroscience and psychology tell us that motivation is not a moral weakness. It is definitely not some personality trait that a few lucky people are born with and you just somehow lack. Actually, it's a highly predictable biological signal system. We really have to stop treating ourselves like broken machines every time we lose our drive. You aren't lacking discipline, you're just experiencing a shift in a really delicate, finely tuned internal system that is constantly reacting to meaning, effort, and friction.
The real aha moment here is realizing that your mind is constantly, subconsciously calculating the cost of taking action. Think of it kind of like a bustling ancient bazaar. The flow of goods along those trade routes changes all the time based on the actual conditions on the ground, things like access, toll costs, weather delays. The flow doesn't stop because the traders suddenly became lazy overnight. And motivation works the exact same way. When the internal route is clear, movement feels completely effortless. But the second the path gets crowded or uncertain, your mind instantly lowers its estimate of success and your energy just stalls out to conserve resources.
It turns out, before your brain gives you the green light and grants you the energy to act, it's subconsciously running through a really rigorous 5-point checklist: value, effort, clarity, timing, and emotion. Every single time your drive surges effortlessly or completely collapses into procrastination, we can trace it right back to these exact 5 forces. When the internal answers to these hidden questions are yes, motivation naturally goes up. But if even just one of these checks flags an issue, your motivation takes a hit. Let's look at that first check, value. Now, we naturally want to believe our motivation obeys pure objective logic, like a calculator, cleanly adding up our long-term benefits. But it totally doesn't. The human mind actually operates way more like a radar. It gets powerfully pulled by what feels important right now. This is exactly why a tiny little ping on your phone can hijack your attention in a split second. Your brain has learned it might matter immediately. Long-term goals, no matter how amazing they are, usually lose out against short-term comfort simply because the mind just can't feel that future reward as vividly as the immediate pain of starting.
Then there's effort. Picture yourself carrying a heavy bucket of water. If the well is just 10 feet away across a nice flat lawn, it's a breeze, right? But what if you're hauling that exact same bucket up a steep, rocky hill completely covered in thorny bushes? The task feels absolutely agonizing. Notice that the water didn't change at all, but the friction did. When a task in your real life requires too many steps or too many micro-decisions, your mind perceives a massive friction cost and instantly cuts your motivation to save energy.
But here's the thing. Even if the path is perfectly smooth, if the lights are off, you still aren't going to walk it. And that brings us to the clarity check. Uncertainty is incredibly expensive for your brain. It literally forces your mind to burn calories holding multiple, exhausting possibilities open all at the same time. This is exactly why a vague goal like, get my life together, usually just ends in a binge-watching session on the couch. But a clear goal, like walk outside for exactly 10 minutes, that actually gets done. Your brain craves visible next steps because certainty drastically lowers the mental cost of taking action. Now, let's talk about timing. Your mind has a really heavy, undeniable bias toward what it can feel right this second. Think about it like the difference between holding a small, warm candle right in your hands versus knowing there's a massive, brilliant lamp locked in a room down the hall. Sure, the lamp gives off way more light, but the candle is warming your hands right now. Because of this, what we often call a lack of motivation is actually just a timing problem. The big, ultimate reward is simply too far away in the future to compete with the immediate, tangible cost of just getting to work.
And coloring all of this, literally the whole shebang, is emotion. You do not make decisions in a sterile vacuum. Every single task carries an emotional hue. It could be hope, it could be deep boredom, lingering fear, or even shame. If a project suddenly feels like a high-stakes test of your fundamental worth as a person, or if it triggers a painful memory of a past failure, your system will quite literally freeze up to protect you from that emotional damage. The logical steps of the task haven't changed, but the emotional meaning has flipped from welcoming to highly threatening.
So what actually happens when these checks start to fail? Well, motivation rarely vanishes dramatically in some theatrical puff of smoke. Instead, it quietly unravels, layer by layer. Honestly, at first, you probably don't even realize you've lost your motivation. You just casually tell yourself, oh, I'll do it later, or I'm just not really feeling it right now. But what's really happening behind the scenes? The task is gathering this invisible mental and emotional weight, and your biological system is quietly hitting the brakes to protect you from that rising cost. The really fascinating part is that from the outside, the task looks completely identical, but internally, it is gathering massive, invisible burdens. Maybe it's the sharp sting of a past failure. Maybe you're demanding absolute, paralyzing perfection from yourself. Or maybe you're just suffocating under the heavy guilt of having put it off for 3 whole weeks. As these very real, but completely invisible costs pile up, your mind's estimate that the effort will actually pay off takes a nosedive. Suddenly, a simple task feels like trying to move an entire mountain.
And that leads us straight into a massive misconception. We constantly mistake avoidance for laziness. But try looking at it from your brain's highly protective point of view. Suddenly deciding you need to reorganize your sock drawer by color or doom scrolling for an hour. That's actually a highly logical way for your brain to reduce immediate discomfort. If the actual task feels threatening or just utterly overwhelming, your brain immediately looks for a release valve. It is not a character flaw, guys. It's simply short-term pain control in action. But of course, this natural instinct for relief traps us in a pretty vicious cycle, the avoidance loop. You avoid the costly task, and boom, you get a wonderful little hit of immediate relief. But that delay, it makes the impending deadline much tighter and way more urgent. And because it's more urgent, the task suddenly feels even costlier and more stressful, which leads to, you guessed it, even more avoidance. The task basically becomes this heavy doorway that gets harder and harder to walk through every single time you turn your back on it. The stark contrast right here perfectly explains why brute force and shame completely fail us. Yelling at yourself to just do it, or trying to shame yourself into action. It is exactly like screaming at a heavy cart that's stuck up to its axles in deep mud. Commanding yourself to just push harder burns precious mental energy and spikes your stress levels, but it doesn't do a single thing to clear the underlying friction that caused the cart to get stuck in the first place. So the ultimate takeaway from today's explainer is a total paradigm shift. We have to move from self-blame to better design. When you finally understand motivation as a reactive system, everything changes. You aren't a broken machine passively waiting for a magical spark of inspiration. You stop asking, what is wrong with me? And you start analytically asking, okay, what changed in the conditions of this task? You learn to read the system behind the feeling, and you become an active designer of your environment rather than just a helpless victim of it. I want to leave you with a really powerful diagnostic question. The very next time your motivation stalls out, look closely at that dreaded task and ask yourself, is it lacking immediate value? Is the effort just too high? Is the very next step unclear? Is the reward way too far away? Or is the emotional load just too heavy today? Because by isolating the specific friction, you can actually fix the environment. You can turn your frustration into actionable design and finally prove to yourself that your character was never the problem.